Most people remember Lucille Ball as a trailblazer, the woman who co-created and starred in I Love Lucy, shattered television rules, and quietly took control of an industry that never expected her to. She was funny, fearless, and decades ahead of her time. But behind the laughter, Lucille Ball was also a no-nonsense woman with a ruthless sense of right and wrong. She didn't play nice for the sake of appearances, and she didn't pretend to admire people she didn't respect. And in the final year of her life, she stopped holding back. According to those closest to her, Lucille Ball openly named 7 celebrities she believed were not just difficult or unpleasant, but truly evil, people she felt crossed moral lines she could never excuse. So, who were these celebrities? What did they do to earn that label? And why did Lucy, of all people, feel compelled to expose them so close to the end of her life? Let's get into all the details. Joan Crawford. If Lucille Ball ever used the word evil, it wasn't lightly. Lucy could handle ego. She could handle insecurity. What she couldn't tolerate was chaos that endangered the work, disrespected the crew, and turned professionalism into a sideshow. That's why Joan Crawford ended up leaving a sour taste. To Lucy, this wasn't about old rivalries or bruised pride. It was about control, discipline, and whether someone showed up ready to work. And on that front, Joan failed her. Years earlier, Joan had been untouchable. A studio-made legend, an Oscar winner, the kind of woman whose name alone could open doors. Back then, Lucille Ball was still clawing for respect, boxed into B pictures, and underestimated at every turn. But by the late 1960s, that old hierarchy was gone. Lucy now ran one of television's biggest shows. She controlled the production, the casting, the tone. And Joan, once the queen of it all, needed the paycheck desperately. On the surface, the setup should have worked. 1 episode, 1 week. 2 women with shared history, shared survival stories, and more than enough professionalism to coexist for a few days. Lucy even handed Joan a storyline built around her own image. In the episode, Lucy and Vivian stumble upon Crawford's new country home. A crumbling fixer-upper, Joan insists on restoring herself. Seeing the disrepair, and Joan dressed down in work clothes, they assume the legendary star has fallen on hard times. A benefit is planned to help her out, and naturally, Joan is asked to headline it. It was clever, it was self-aware, and it cut a little too close to the truth. Because behind the scenes, Joan was struggling, and almost immediately, the cracks began to show. It was no secret that Joan liked to drink during the day, or 2, or 3. Her ever-present silver flask, usually filled with vodka, often found its way into her Pepsi. Lucy, no saint herself, had one hard rule she never bent: no drinking on her set. When Lucy noticed the flask, she was furious. When Joan showed up late on top of that, Lucy went nuclear. Reportedly, Lucy called Joan directly, and the conversation exploded into a vicious phone fight. There was no coddling, no reverence for Joan's legacy. Lucy allegedly told the Oscar winner to get herself together, or she'd be fired on the spot. And just to drive the point home, Lucy reminded her that the role hadn't even been written for her originally. It had been intended for Gloria Swanson, and Lucy had no problem calling her instead. From that moment on, Lucy decided Joan was drunk during filming. Whether she was or not almost didn't matter. The trust was gone. Watch the episode closely and make up your own mind. Joan's voice wavers. Her confidence feels unsteady. She seems oddly uncomfortable playing herself, struggling to project, struggling to settle into the rhythm. Some believe she was intimidated by Lucy's authority. Others believe the alcoholism had already taken control. What followed was the real humiliation. Lucy forced Joan to repeat a dance number again and again in front of a live audience, only to cut it entirely at the last minute. For Joan, this wasn't just embarrassing, it was devastating. She had started her career as a dancer. Movement was her foundation, and Lucy knew exactly what she was taking from her in that moment. When the final shot wrapped, Joan didn't hide her fury. She openly remarked that people called her a beach. But Lucy could outdo her any day of the week. And that's where the real reason Lucy couldn't stand Joan comes into focus. To Lucy, Joan didn't just break rules. She showed up unprepared, unprofessional, and entitled in a space Lucy had fought tooth and nail to control. Lucy had spent her life proving she deserved power. Joan walked in expecting it to be handed back to her. And that, more than the drinking, more than the lateness, was the line Lucy never forgave. Alfred Hitchcock. If there was one thing Lucille Ball could not stomach, it was men in power who mistook fear for loyalty and control for talent. She had spent her entire career fighting to be taken seriously, in rooms run by men who thought intimidation was leadership. So when stories about Alfred Hitchcock began circulating, they didn't just register as gossip to Lucy, they hit a nerve. By the 1960s, Hitchcock wasn't just a director. He was a brand, a genius, untouchable. Studios bent around him, and actresses were expected to fall in line. From the outside, his sets looked disciplined, exacting, and even brilliant. But behind that polished image was something darker. Something Lucy, who ran her own sets with ironclad standards and basic human decency, found unforgivable. And no one embodied that darker side more clearly than Tippi Hedren. Hedren was a relative unknown when Hitchcock plucked her out of obscurity and cast her in The Birds in 1963, followed by Marnie the following year. To the public, it looked like a fairy tale, the master director discovering a new star. Behind closed doors, it was anything but. According to Hedren, Hitchcock's behavior quickly crossed professional boundaries and turned into something far more disturbing. She later claimed that during their work together, Hitchcock sexually harassed her, including an incident in which he allegedly threw himself on her in the back of his limousine and tried to kiss her. Hedren described it as an awful, awful moment, one that left her shocked and shaken. She didn't tell anyone at the time, not because it didn't matter, but because the language to describe it didn't exist yet. Sexual harassment and stalking weren't recognized concepts in early 1960s Hollywood. And even if they had been, Hedren understood the reality of her position. Hitchcock was one of Universal's biggest assets. She was a lucky blonde model he had discovered. In her own words, the imbalance was obvious. The studio would protect him, not her. And it didn't stop there. Hedren later described another encounter in Hitchcock's office, where he suddenly grabbed her and put his hands on her. She wrote that it was sexual, perverse, and ugly, and that she couldn't have been more repulsed. When she fought back, she said he became more aggressive. Then came the threats. Hitchcock allegedly warned her that he could ruin her career, looking directly into her eyes, his face red with rage, promising exactly that. When Hedren refused his advances, the punishment followed. She claimed Hitchcock deliberately sabotaged her career, refusing to submit her performances for Oscar consideration and blocking her from taking other roles while she was still under contract to him. Opportunities dried up. Momentum vanished. What should have been the launch of a major career quietly stalled. For someone like Lucille Ball, this kind of behavior would have been more than reprehensible. Lucy knew what power could do. She knew how easily men used it to silence, control, and erase women who refused to comply. And unlike Hitchcock, Lucy believed authority came with responsibility. You protected people on your set. You didn't terrorize them. Hedren eventually spoke out in detail decades later in her autobiography, Tippi, a memoir published when she was 86. By then, the damage had already been done. Still, she made it clear that while Hitchcock may have damaged her career, he never succeeded in destroying her life. She said she made it her mission never to give him that power. Despite everything, Hedren admitted she felt a wave of sadness when Hitchcock died in 1980. She even attended his funeral, surprising many. For her, it wasn't forgiveness so much as closure. She wrote that there was no unfinished business, nothing left to say. She had healed and moved on. That nuance matters, but it doesn't erase the harm. And it explains why Lucille Ball would have quietly filed Hitchcock away as something worse than difficult or demanding. To Lucy, genius never excused cruelty, talent never justified abuse, and anyone who used their power to corner, threaten, or destroy another person didn't belong in the same category as flawed legends. They belonged somewhere darker. Ronald Reagan. Before the speeches, the smiles, and the carefully burnished image of decency, Ronald Reagan was a Hollywood actor moving comfortably through the same studio system Lucille Ball had spent years learning to survive. And that's exactly why his name would have landed differently with Lucy. She knew how power worked in that town. She knew how charm could be used as cover. And she knew how easily women were expected to absorb harm quietly and keep moving. Long before Reagan entered politics, accusations followed him from his acting years. Allegations that never fit the wholesome persona were later sold to the public. Actresses Celine Walters and Piper Laurie both made claims of sexual misconduct involving Reagan, describing encounters that painted a far darker picture of the man behind the grin. Walters' account was the most disturbing. She said she met Reagan at a Hollywood nightclub in the 1950s, a time when his career was still active and his access unquestioned. According to her, Reagan asked for her address. She gave it to him casually, not expecting anything more. Then, hours later, at 3 a.m., he showed up at her door. What followed, she later described, was not consensual. Walters recounted that when she opened the door, Reagan forced himself inside. She described what she called a battle of the couch, saying she fought him, repeatedly telling him she did not want him to make love to her. She said he was a very big man, and that despite her resistance, he overpowered her and raped her. The way she told it wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was flat, matter-of-fact, the kind of tone people use when they've lived with something for decades and learned how not to fall apart while saying it out loud. She later shared this account publicly, including in an interview with People magazine, long after Reagan had reinvented himself as a moral authority figure on the national stage. Piper Laurie also made allegations of sexual misconduct, adding to the sense that Reagan's behavior in Hollywood followed a troubling pattern. Together, the claims painted a picture of a man who moved through the industry with the confidence of someone who believed he would never be challenged. And at the time, he wasn't wrong. This is where Lucille Ball's perspective matters. Lucy had clawed her way up in the same era. She had seen women blacklisted, silenced, laughed off, or quietly pushed aside for less. She understood the cost of speaking up when the man involved was powerful, popular, and protected. And she had no patience for men who used their status to corner women and then went on to be celebrated as decent, honorable, or heroic. To Lucy, this wasn't about politics or later accomplishments. It was about character, about what someone did when no one was watching, about the women who carried the consequences while the men carried on, unbothered. So when Reagan eventually re-emerged as a public figure wrapped in morality and patriotism, Lucy would have remembered the stories Hollywood whispered long before the country applauded. And for someone like her, who believed power should never excuse cruelty, that kind of history wasn't something time could clean up. It wasn't forgettable, and it certainly wasn't forgivable. Peter Sellers. If Lucille Ball had a lifelong allergy, it was chaos disguised as genius. She respected talent, but she had no patience for people who weaponized it. So when it came to Peter Sellers, Lucy saw past the brilliance very quickly. To her, genius wasn't an excuse to terrorize sets, humiliate colleagues, or leave destruction in your wake. And Sellers did all three. On screen, he was electric, one of the most gifted comedic actors of the 20th century. Off-screen, he was widely described as a nightmare. Explosive tantrums, screaming fits, cruel behavior toward his wives, erratic, sometimes vaguely racist conduct. A man permanently at war with himself and everyone around him. Those who worked with Sellers didn't mince words. He was described as expensive, difficult, ungracious, and despotic. A man who fired directors, flipped scripts upside down, and poisoned projects with his volatility. His mental health struggles were real and severe, But they were also untreated, heavily fueled by alcohol and drug abuse, and too often taken out on the people trying to work with him. Even stable, well-run productions struggled to contain him. Unstable ones didn't stand a chance. Which brings us to one of the clearest examples of why Sellers' reputation curdled into something darker. In the early 1970s, director Peter Medak was riding high after the success of The Ruling Class. When Sellers approached him with the idea of adapting the 1965 novel Ghost in the Noonday Sun into a pirate comedy, it seemed like fate. A rising director, a comedy legend, a quirky premise. What could go wrong? Almost everything. The film was shot largely off the coast of Cyprus, aboard a sailing vessel. Medak later admitted he had underestimated the sheer difficulty of filming at sea. Vomiting crew members, constant motion, unusable shots. Even with a calm star, the project would have been a logistical nightmare. The pirate ship itself was crashed by a drunk captain before production even properly began. Then there was Sellers. Fresh off a painful breakup with Liza Minnelli, Sellers arrived already ill-tempered and disengaged. He quickly soured on the film, demanded rewrites from his frequent collaborator Spike Milligan, and began undermining the production almost immediately. That was on the days he showed up at all. According to Medak, Sellers routinely failed to arrive on set until mid-afternoon. Cast and crew would wait aboard the ship for hours, burning daylight until filming became almost pointless. Sometimes Sellers claimed illness to avoid working. At one point, he even faked a heart attack, a particularly grotesque move given his real history of heart problems, just so he could fly back to London and party with Princess Margaret. The behavior wasn't accidental. It was sabotage. Sellers' antics didn't stop the film from being completed, but they ensured it would never see a proper release. When Medak turned in the finished movie to Columbia Pictures, the studio deemed it unsuitable for theatrical distribution. It was shelved and only surfaced years later on home video, long after Sellers' death from a heart attack in 1980. For Lucille Ball, this kind of conduct wasn't eccentric. It was unethical. Lucy believed sets should be safe, efficient, and respectful. She ran hers with discipline because she understood how fragile productions were and how many livelihoods depended on things going right. Sellers didn't just derail projects. He humiliated crews, wasted resources, and left others to clean up the wreckage of his moods. That's why, to Lucy, Peter Sellers wouldn't have been remembered as merely difficult. He would have been filed under something worse. A man who knew his power, knew the damage he caused, and kept doing it anyway. And in Lucy's world, that crossed the line from brilliant to unforgivable. Clark Gable. Lucille Ball never confused charm with character. She had worked too long, seen too much, and survived an industry that rewarded men for behavior women were expected to endure quietly. So when it came to Clark Gable, the shine never fully worked on her. To Lucy, the problem wasn't his talent, it was the pattern beneath it, the way power followed him, protected him, and excused things that should never have been excused. For decades, Clark Gable was marketed as the king of Hollywood. Confident, masculine, untouchable, but behind that carefully guarded image sat a secret that many in the industry whispered about and few ever confronted head-on. In her later years, Loretta Young revealed that Gable had RA'd her during the filming of The Call of the Wild in the 1930s. It was one of Hollywood's worst-kept secrets, something insiders had known for years but chosen not to challenge. The trauma didn't end with the act itself. It followed Young for decades, shaping her life, her choices, and the way she moved through the world well into the 1950s and beyond. Gable, meanwhile, continued forward untouched. He was obsessively protective of his image, wary of any role that made him look weak, flawed, defeated, or mortal. He famously resisted playing Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind, dismissing it as a woman's picture. He only accepted after overwhelming public pressure and still refused to even attempt a Southern accent. The illusion mattered more than the craft. On set, Gable projected discipline and authority. He wasn't afraid of powerful directors and openly challenged them when he felt they crossed a line. During the filming of Mogambo, he repeatedly walked off set when director John Ford bullied other actors, effectively shutting down production until Ford backed off. That move earned him respect from some and resentment from others, including John Wayne, who was fiercely loyal to Ford and never forgave the challenge. Professionally, Gable prided himself on punctuality and preparation. He arrived early. He knew his lines. He took responsibility seriously. That's why he was privately furious during the filming of The Misfits, where chronic delays caused by Marilyn Monroe enraged him. He reportedly referred to the wasted time as stealing from the studio, a rare glimpse into how rigid his internal code really was. But that sense of discipline stopped where his personal behavior began. Off-screen, Gable was a notorious womanizer, and the allegation from Loretta Young cast a permanent shadow over his legacy. No amount of professionalism, no carefully curated image, could erase the reality of what she described. A powerful man acting with total impunity, confident the system would protect him. And it did. There were other contradictions too. Despite an obsession with cleanliness in his private life, co-stars like Vivien Leigh and Joan Crawford reportedly complained about his severe bad breath, caused by a chronic gum infection that eventually led him to wear dentures. Friends later noted that Gable carried a deep sadness, shaped by a difficult childhood and devastating personal losses, especially the death of his wife, Carole Lombard. He struggled to form deep attachments, numbed himself with alcohol, and became a heavy chain smoker. Some believe this slow unraveling contributed to his early death. Lucille Ball saw all of this clearly. The discipline on set, the cruelty of it, the way men like Gable were allowed to compartmentalize their lives while women paid the price in silence. To Lucy, this wasn't complexity. It was hypocrisy. And that's why, beneath the legend, Clark Gable landed firmly on Lucy's list. Not because he lacked talent, but because he wielded power without accountability. Kirk Douglas. Lucille Ball had a long memory, especially when it came to men who used the studio system as armor. She knew how easily Hollywood protected its stars, and how quickly young women were taught to stay quiet for the sake of a career. So when Kirk Douglas came up in private conversations, the issue wouldn't have been his talent or ambition. It would have been what power allowed him to get away with and who paid the price for it. For decades, there has been a widely circulated allegation that Douglas raped Natalie Wood when she was a teenager in the 1950s. At the time, Wood was a child star transitioning into adult roles, still vulnerable, still controlled by her mother and the studio machinery around her. The incident, according to those closest to her, was quietly buried by Hollywood, treated as collateral damage in an industry that prioritized male stars and box office returns. Douglas, meanwhile, continued to rise. Professionally, he was known as a force. One of the first major actors to form his own production company, he took pride in creative control and didn't hesitate to use it. He famously fired director Anthony Mann after just 1 week on Spartacus and reportedly clashed with Stanley Kubrick while trying to micromanage Paths of Glory. His tough upbringing bred intensity, ambition, and a take-no-prisoners attitude that often blurred the line between the hard man he played on screen and the man he was off it. His personal life followed the same pattern. Douglas openly admitted to cheating on his first wife, Diana Dill, and earned a reputation in Hollywood as volatile, domineering, and deeply complicated. To many, this was excused as passion. To others, it was a warning sign. Natalie Wood's story unfolded alongside all of this. She had been a working actress since childhood, first winning Hearts in Miracle on 34th Street. At just 16, she earned an Oscar nomination for Rebel Without a Cause, proving she was more than a former child star. More acclaim followed, with nominations for Splendor in the Grass and Love with the Proper Stranger. And then there was West Side Story, where her performance as Maria cemented her place in Hollywood history. But behind the success, there was trauma she carried quietly. Natalie's younger sister, Lana Wood, later alleged that Douglas was the man who sexually assaulted her sister. According to Lana, The incident occurred in the summer of 1955, when Natalie was 16 or 17. Their mother, Maria Zakharenko, allegedly arranged a meeting between Natalie and Douglas at the Chateau Marmont, believing his favor could open doors. Lana recalled waiting in the car while Natalie went inside. When her sister returned, she was disheveled, shaken, and visibly upset. Something was wrong, but Lana was too young to be told what had happened. Years later, as adults, Natalie finally confided in her, telling her sister that Douglas had hurt her. Lana described Natalie recounting the experience as terrifying, confusing, and deeply scarring. According to Lana, both Natalie and their mother believed accusing Douglas publicly would destroy Natalie's career. The advice given to her was brutally simple: suck it up. Douglas was in his late 30s at the time of the alleged assault. Natalie was still a teenager. The rumors never fully disappeared. They followed Douglas quietly for decades, resurfacing repeatedly in Hollywood circles. When he died in 2020 at age 103, Natalie Wood's name trended alongside his, a sign that the questions surrounding his legacy had never gone away. Lucille Ball would have understood exactly how this silence was engineered. She had seen it happen too many times. Young actresses positioned as expendable. Mothers are pressured to think pragmatically. Studios are eager to protect their investments. Men insulated by fame. To Lucy, this wasn't about complexity or moral gray areas. It was about a system that rewarded dominance and punished vulnerability. And any man who thrived inside that system while leaving damage behind would never earn her respect. That's why Kirk Douglas, for all his accomplishments, landed firmly on her list. Not as a difficult personality, not as a flawed genius, but as someone whose power came at too high a cost, paid quietly by someone who never should have had to carry it alone. Bette Davis. At first glance, Bette Davis looks like she should belong on Lucille Ball's bad list. Sharp elbows, acid tongue, a reputation for chewing through co-stars and leaving scorch marks behind. Lucy had little tolerance for cruelty, dressed up as genius. So on paper, Davis looks like a natural fit for the villain column. But this is where the story takes a turn. Because unlike so many others, Bette Davis crossed Lucy's path without crossing her line. Their history went back further than fame. Long before the Oscars and the Legends, both women attended John Murray Anderson's dramatic school in New York. Davis was already intense, driven, and unmistakably serious. Lucy, by contrast, was often overlooked, shy, quiet, not yet the force she would become. It would have been easy for resentment to grow there, especially given how differently their careers initially unfolded. But it didn't. Instead, what formed between them was something rarer in Hollywood: mutual recognition. Bette Davis became famous for her feuds, most notoriously with Joan Crawford. Those battles were personal, bitter, and unapologetic, but Lucille Ball was never part of that war. If anything, Lucy understood Davis. She saw the discipline beneath the abrasiveness, the seriousness beneath the scowl, and Davis, for her part, recognized that Lucy's comedy wasn't fluff, it was craft. There's a story that captures their dynamic perfectly. During a turbulent flight packed with Hollywood stars, Davis reportedly turned to Lucy and asked, half joking and half anxious, who the newspapers would list first if the plane went down. It was a question soaked in ego, fear, and reputation. Without missing a beat, Lucy replied that it would be Davis. The line landed as a joke, but it carried something deeper. An acknowledgement that when it came to gravitas and prestige, Bette Davis stood at the top, and Davis knew it wasn't a dig. That exchange mattered. Lucy wasn't threatened by Davis's seriousness, and Davis wasn't dismissive of Lucy's comedy. Each knew exactly who the other was. In an industry where insecurity often curdled into cruelty, that kind of clarity went a long way. So if Lucille Ball ever weighed Bette Davis on a moral scale, this is likely where she landed. Difficult? Yes. Intense? Absolutely. But not evil, not abusive, not someone who hid behind power or destroyed others to protect an image. Davis was sharp, but she was honest about it. And for Lucy, that made all the difference. In a list filled with men who exploited silence and women who weaponized cruelty, Bette Davis stood apart. She wasn't someone Lucy needed to expose, she was someone Lucy respected. And in Lucille Ball's world, respect was earned, not granted. Which name on the list shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.